This is truly one of my favorite classes to teach. Welcome to our first lecture in constitutional law. And this class is going to end up being a little bit different, and I know you guys are going to love it. But I still have to start out with kind of an introduction, and we're going to go a little bit deeper than you probably wanted to when it comes to the government and the law. But it's foundational, and I promise, hopefully, it'll be at least informative for you. But um, we have to talk about how the legal system, in the US came to be and, more importantly, like how it continues to evolve. And we're going to start at the beginning, okay? And I don't mean just like with the Constitution, but with the context in which it was created. Like the founding of our country wasn't like some kind of clean break or like a perfect moment of unity. It was messy. It was exclusionary. It was full of contradictions, right? But it was bold and it was revolutionary, right? Um, so we're going to start out with like the framework for understanding like how our Constitution emerged. Who was involved in that? Who was excluded? What problems were they trying to solve? What were how the foundations of American law was kind of rooted in compromise and resistance and political necessity. We're getting down to the nitty gritty, right? And we're going to talk about the things that we just didn't learn in our, social studies classes. So before we can talk about where it began, we actually have to back up to some definitions. Law. I know it sounds so simple, but it is a body of rules that are promulgated, which means established, to support the norms of the society. And it's enforced through legal means, which is punishment. The Constitution is a system of basic laws and principles that establish the nature, functions, and limits of a government or other institution. And remember that the US Constitution is actually quite young compared to other government frameworks around the world. And yet it has survived and it has evolved for over 200 years, which I think speaks at least a little bit to its flexibility and its foundation in some universal ideas. So, pluralism is where we're going to really start. And that refers to a society in which there are numerous distinct ethnic, religious, or cultural groups, and they coexist within one nation, and they're each contributing to a society as a whole. And in 1775, the American landscape was kind of defined by three groups, right? You have the American Indians, which were these indigenous nations, and they had these sophisticated governing systems. For example, take the Iroquois Confederacy, for instance. They had a federal structure that was not unlike what we eventually developed, right? But these communities were ignored in constitutional deliberations. You had the enslaved Africans, and their forced labor created massive economic value for the colonies, right? They were present and vital to the economy, but denied any rights. And when the Constitution was written, these individuals weren't even considered citizens. They were counted partially for political power, but they weren't ever protected. And then you have the colonists. And these were especially land owning white men who shaped what would become the United States. But even among them, there were still divisions. Like you had loyalists versus revolutionaries, you had merchants versus farmers, you had elites versus commoners, right? So, yeah, you had these three different groups. And again, each of them contributed to the fabric of this new country, right? But most of history tends to focus on the colonists. Now, you have ideals that did begin to circulate at this time, and it was concepts like, we'll say ideals, like liberty and sovereignty and, limited government. And they were radical, right? Liberty is the freedom to live as one chooses and applies to basically all areas of one's life, whether it's their religion, their education, economics, whatever. Sovereignty is the concept that defines where political power rests, or better yet, defines who holds that political power, right? And the limited government is to ensure that power is checked and it's not absolute. It's supposed to restrict the power of government and protect the individual rights and civil liberties of the citizenry. So we have to talk about the development of the United States, right? And we have to talk about like what led to that break from Britain. You have this colonial dissension that's growing. You have Great Britain who has these like major problems, two major problems really. You have this westward settlement by colonists and this huge debt from military action. But there's so much more. So the Stamp Act of 1765 was probably the first of the major sparks, right? It was passed by the British Parliament and it required American colonists to pay a tax on every piece of printed paper that they used. And this included legal documents, licenses, newspapers, playing cards, whatever. And the money was intended to help pay for British troops that were stationed in North America following the French and Indian War. But the colonists saw this differently, right? They had no representation in Parliament. And so they believed that this tax violated, their rights as Englishmen. Okay. This was it wasn't about money. It was about principle, right? It was the birth of the phrase, no taxation without representation. So you have outrage and it's widespread. It led to protests and formation of groups like the Sons of Liberty. And it eventually led to the repeal of the Act in 1760, I think 1766. But at this point, the damage to colonial British relations was done. I mean, think about it. How frustrating would it have been to buy a federal watermark, basically to just write a will or to publish a newspaper, or even to play a game, a card game? Again, this was taxation without representation, and the colonists were outraged. Now, the Quartering Act also passed in 1765, and this just poured salt in that wound, okay? It added insult to injury. It required colonial governments to provide and pay for lodging and provisions for British soldiers. And it was often in private homes and in inns and even in barns. And this wasn't just an inconvenience, it felt like an occupation, right? And many colonists viewed the presence of the British troops in peacetime as a threat to their liberties. And the idea that the citizens could be forced to house armed soldiers was seen as an egregious violation of privacy and property rights. Okay. And this act later inspired the Third Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which specifically prohibits the quartering of soldiers in private homes during peace times without the owner's consent. I mean, like, take that in. Imagine like soldiers just showing up at your house and you have no legal authority to refuse. This literally invaded, privacy and fueled this like growing distrust. So tensions escalated further with the Boston Tea Party. And this is where the British had granted a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies through the Tea Act, which allowed the East India Company to sell directly to consumers at reduced prices, right? But it still had a tax that was attached. So colonists saw this as a sneaky way to get them to accept the right of Parliament to tax them. And on the night of the Boston Tea Party, you have a group of colonists who were disguised as Mohawk Indians board these British ships in the Boston Harbor, and they dumped over 300 chests of tea into the water. And this act of defiance cost the British the modern equivalent of nearly $2 million. And in response, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts. And it was also known as the Intolerable Acts. But it closed Boston Harbor, it revoked Massachusetts charter, and it allowed British officials that were accused of crimes to be tried in Britain. And the colonists saw this as intolerable, an intolerable like violation of their rights. And it was this moment that united so many previously hesitant, colonies into a common cause now against the crown. So in response, the First Continental Congress met in 1774 in Philadelphia as a direct response to the Intolerable Acts. You had 55 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies that attended. Georgia was the only one that was not represented. And those delegates didn't initially seek independence, right? They sought reconciliation with Britain, but on terms that respected colonial rights. So they had drafted a Declaration of Rights. They agreed on this economic boycott of British goods, and they petitioned King George III to repeal the offending legislation. So while the Congress had no legal authority, it was a bold step toward unity. Like, it showed the colonies could come together and act in concert. And they agreed to reconvene if their grievances weren't addressed. And that was a move that would prove critical when the war broke out the following year. Now, it's important to note here that even at this stage, there were still deep divides. Like, you had some colonists that remained, loyal to the crown. And they were the ones that were fearing revolution would bring like chaos. And these were the loyalists or the Tories. And they included like many merchants and Anglican clergy, government officials who had like benefited under British rule. Again, they believed that the colonies could still like negotiate fair treatment, but within the empire. Now, on the other side, you have the patriots or the rebels, and they believed the time for negotiation was long past, right? And they were often younger and more poor, and they were heavily influenced by the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and self governance. And the debate between the loyalists and the patriots wasn't just ideological, like, it divided towns and congregations and even families. And the American Revolution was, in many ways, kind of a civil war. Um, but amid these tensions that were rising, you have these colonial militias that begin to form. And among them was the Minutemen. And they were civilian colonists who were trained to be ready to fight at a minute's notice. They were not professional soldiers. They were farmers and tradesmen and laborers who stood guard at night. They drilled regularly, and they kept their weapons at, they were ready, right? And the Minutemen became famous for their role in the opening battles of the Revolution at Lexington and Concord, where they ended up facing off against the British troops in what would become the shot heard round the world. Now, in March of 1775, Patrick Henry, a delegate from Virginia, delivered what would become one of the most electrifying speeches in American history. And he was speaking at the Second Virginia Convention in St. John's Church in Richmond. And Henry, he wanted his fellow colonists to prepare for war, right? And at this time, you have a lot of leaders who still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, but not Patrick Henry. He challenged the optimism head on. Like, he passionately argued the colonies had done everything in their power to avoid conflict. They had petitioned, they had protested, they had pleaded, and their efforts were met with increased oppression. And he described the presence of the British troops and warships as a clear and present threat. His speech essentially culminated in this fiery declaration: give me liberty or give me death, right? And this was more than dramatic. Like, this was a moral ultimatum. He wasn't just advocating for war. He was arguing that liberty was so essential, so inherent to human dignity, that life without it was just not worth living, right? And his words actually moved a lot of undecided delegates. It helped to, turn indecision into resolve. Like, it encouraged the formation of militias and pushing Virginia, who was a very politically powerful, populated colony, closer to supporting an armed resistance against Britain. It's also important to note here that while the revolution is often, kind of portrayed as like this grassroots uprising, it was also led, financed, designed by and for those with social and economic power. Okay. So most of the political and military leadership came from the colonial elite. It was the wealthy landowners, the merchants, and educated men. And these individuals had the means to organize, to travel, and to influence public opinion. And their resources were essential when it came to funding the armies, for printing their pamphlets and for negotiating international alliances. And this doesn't mean that the poor and like the working class weren't involved, because they absolutely were. But the leadership and the decision making largely came from the top. So when violence ends up erupting at the battles of Lexington and Concord, the colonies now found themselves in open conflict. So you have British troops that attempted to kind of seize the colonial arms, go arrest the revolutionaries, but they were met with resistance by these local militias, including those famed Minutemen. And these kind of opening skirmishes, again later dubbed as the Shot Heard Round the World, confirmed what many people like Patrick Henry had feared. There was no turning back. Revolution, it was on. So the Second Continental Congress convened in May of 1775, and this was just a few weeks after the battles of Lexington and Concord had signaled that we're at the start of an open conflict now, right? So unlike the first Congress, which had focused on petitioning the king and kind of asserting colonial rights, this Congress had to prepare for like this full scale war, right? One of their first actions was to establish the Continental Army, and they appointed George Washington as commander in chief. And Washington was chose not only for his military experience, but also as a unifying figure. The Virginian who could help bring together kind of the northern and southern colonies. By the way, I don't know if you've seen Hamilton or not, but in this particular part, when I start talking about all of this, I always think of Hamilton, and particularly like two songs in the whole thing about him. Anyhow, I digress. But the Congress, they also took on this major responsibility. They had to raise money, and they had to secure supplies for the war effort. And so they authorized the printing of this continental currency. They had to manage like logistics for food and weapons, and they had to coordinate the establish of a postal service to kind of improve communications across the colonies. So now they also recognize, like, look, we need this international support. So the delegates began to seek diplomatic alliances, and they established committees to correspond with foreign governments, most notably France, who would actually end up becoming a very critical ally. But those early diplomatic efforts were crucial because they laid that groundwork for those formal treaties that would bring very essential military and financial aid. Now, in the alternative over here, you've got these delegates who are still hoping for, reconciliation. You had the failure of the Olive Branch Petition, which was this final plea to King George III for peace, and he made it clear, the Olive Branch Petition made it clear that war was inevitable, and the king refused to even read the petition, and he just said, he declared the colonies to be in this, state of open rebellion. And from that point forward, the colonies moved toward declaring independence and really preparing for a very long and difficult fight. And they had several, early victories. And these battles kind of helped to rally support for the revolutionary cause itself. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga, it secured valuable artillery for the Continental Army. Then you have the Battle of Bunker Hill. And while technically a British victory, it did prove that colonial militias could stand up to professional troops. Then you have the Battle of Trenton, where Washington led a surprise attack across, after crossing the Delaware. And that was a huge, morale boost. And then you have the Battle of Saratoga, which marked a turning point. And that was convincing France that the American cause, this is viable. And it led to a formal military alliance. And these battles kind of showcased the colonists' resolve, their commitment. They were, as Hamilton said, we're outgunned, outmanned. They were underfunded and they were outgunned. But the people were still very determined to fight for independence, right? And the Second Continental Congress became the kind of the political and administrative engine that was kind of driving this struggle forward. Now we have the Declaration of Independence, which was signed in 1776, and this was both a bold assertion of freedom. It was revolutionary, but it was also an act of treason under British law. And by putting their names on the documents, the signers were essentially signing their own death warrants if the revolution failed. Okay. And signing the declaration, okay, it was punishable by death. And 9 of the 56 signers, they died during the Revolutionary War. Many other ones lost everything, like homes burned, families harassed, properties looted by British forces or loyalists. Um, and this wasn't just a symbolic stand, like, this was incredibly dangerous and it was a sacrificial act. And so the Declaration boldly stated that all men were created equal and they were endowed with this unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we have to remember that this ideal did not yet apply to everyone. You have enslaved people, you have women, you have Native Americans, and you even have some poor white men who were left out of these promises. But nonetheless, the document did provide like this philosophical foundation that would end up shaping the evolution of American law for centuries to come. So after independence, you have this new little fledgling United States, right? And it needed to form a new government. And that came in the form of the Articles of Confederation. And they were ratified in 1781. And the articles describe the union of the states as a firm league of friendship and a perpetual union. This was a confederation. And that meant that each state retained its sovereignty, its freedom, and its independence, right? But they had a central government that had extremely limited powers. It could make treaties, it could declare war, but it couldn't tax or it couldn't regulate commerce or even enforce laws directly on individuals. So the founders had just like escaped what they saw as this tyrannical, like centralized British government, and they feared replacing it with another one. So they intentionally made the federal government weak. And the power was divided among the states, and any major change required a unanimous approval from all 13. And that system very quickly proved to be problematic. Without the ability to collect taxes, to regulate trade, the federal government was practically powerless, right? And the clearest example of its failure came during Shays' Rebellion. And that was in 1786. And it was led by Daniel Shays. And he was a former Revolutionary War captain. And you have this group of indebted Massachusetts farmers, and a lot of them are veterans, and they rose up in protest over tax increases and in foreclosures, and they shut down courts and they tried to seize, a federal arsenal. And the state militia eventually suppressed this rebellion, but the federal government, they couldn't do anything. So Shays' Rebellion was kind of a wake up call, and it highlighted some of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And it convinced many of the leaders, even those who were kind of, I don't know, standoffish or skeptical, we'll say skeptical, of this strong central power that the system needed to be replaced, right? But this did pave the way for the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And this convention convened in Philadelphia, and the delegates decided to scrap the articles and start fresh. So you have the delegates that are representing 12 of the 13 states in 1787. They decided that the Articles of Confederation were beyond repair. By the way, before you ask me who is not there, it was Rhode Island who did not send delegates to that particular convention. But I did want to say that it's not actually accurate to say that they didn't send, because the Continental Congress, the second one, it actually met for like a span of years. So this was just like one part of it. But anyhow, in 1787, they were not there though. But the goal was clear here. They needed to design a stronger national government, and one that could unify the states while avoiding the tyranny that they had just fought against in the Revolutionary War. Now, before we go further from here, we need to deviate for just a minute. So our framers were heavily influenced by the Magna Carta. And it is often cited as kind of like the cornerstone of English liberty. And this document established the supremacy of law over the ruler, meaning that even kings were not above the law. And it assured, basic rights like due process, where the legal procedures must be followed before depriving somebody of life, liberty, or property. And these principles inspired the founders and would later be embedded into the Constitution and to the Bill of Rights. But the Magna Carta served as a precedent for democratic government and individual rights that were transcending this monarchical rule. Okay, now we can circle back. I just had to throw that in there. But so the purpose of the Constitutional Convention was to create this central government that was strong enough to govern effectively, but still limited enough to protect those individual freedoms. And the delegates aimed to sort of embed the checks and balances into the system to make sure that no one branch of the government could dominate the others. And that vision was at the heart of constitutionalism, the belief that the government's power has to be distributed and constrained by the laws. Now let's talk about the major issues that were debated intensely, okay? Because the structure and the powers of Congress were a key focus. Like, how would states be represented? Like, should the power rest with more with the people or to the states? The executive branch. What would the president would the president be basically a king in disguise? How much power should the president be able to wield? The judicial system, like what role would the courts play when it came to interpreting the laws or, mediating disputes? With constitutionalism, like how do you enforce a written document against its enforcers? The rule of secrecy, like deliberations that were kept secret to avoid public pressure and to allow free debate, was controversial, but strategic. And from this, two competing plans emerged. First, we have the Virginia Plan, and this was presented by Edmund Randolph, and it was primarily written by James Madison. And it was the first comprehensive proposal for a new government at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And it was favored by the delegates from larger states like Virginia and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts because it was built on the principle of proportional representation. So the Virginia Plan proposed a strong national government with three separate branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, to create clear separation of powers. It would have the two-chamber legislature where both would be based representation on a state's population or financial contributions to the national government. The lower house would be elected by the people, while the upper house would be chosen by the members of the lower house. The national legislature would have the power to veto state laws and use military force against the states that didn't comply with any kind of national policies. And then you have a national judiciary that's appointed by the legislature. So the logic behind the Virginia Plan was pretty straightforward. It was states with more people should have more influence in the legislative process. But those smaller states saw this as a threat to their sovereignty and really to their political survival. And so they feared being overpowered by the more populous states in every national decision. So, in direct response to the Virginia Plan, William Paterson of New Jersey introduced what would become known as the New Jersey Plan. And this reflected the interests of the smaller states. And this presented, a single chamber legislature where each state would only have one vote, and it was regardless of its population or its wealth. And this was just like under the Articles of Confederation. Then you have the continuation of equal representation, which was ensuring that the small states would not be dominated by the larger ones. You had limited expansion of federal powers to basically include the ability to levy taxes and regulate commerce. You have a plural executive who is chosen by the legislature, and that is to prevent one person from becoming too powerful. You have a national judiciary who's appointed by the executive with limited jurisdiction, okay? But the New Jersey Plan didn't seek basically to abandon the Articles of Confederation completely, right? It aimed to kind of strengthen the existing structure while preserving the state like equality and autonomy. So the smaller states argued that they had entered the union as equals and they should remain equal in legislative representation regardless of the size of their population. So by the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention was at risk of falling apart. It was over a single but really fundamental issue, and that was representation in the national legislature. So the larger states, like Virginia and Pennsylvania, they supported the Virginia Plan, and that proposed again the representation based on population. They argued that states with more people should naturally have more influence in crafting national policy. After all, they're contributing, more to the economy. They have bigger militias and they represent more citizens. Now, on the other hand, you still have the smaller states like New Jersey, Delaware, and Connecticut. And they are fearing being completely overshadowed. So they supported the New Jersey plan, which called for equal representation regardless of size. And they reminded their fellow delegates that states had entered this Revolutionary War and the Articles of Confederation as equals and saw absolutely no reason why that status should change in this new constitution. And this dispute created a stalemate. And it was kind of a dangerous one. And without an agreement on how Congress would be structured, the entire convention could literally unravel, right? So the stakes were enormous. No new constitution meant no effective government. And you have this fragile union of 13 states that could dissolve into, regional conflict or chaos. So the Great Compromise then enters the chat. The deadlock was broken by the delegates from Connecticut, which was primarily Roger Sherman, and there's another guy, I can't remember his name, but proposed what became known as the Great Compromise. And it, again, gave the two chambers for the legislature. So it created what we now know as Congress. So you have the House of Representatives, which would be based on population. So states with more people would have more representatives, and this satisfied the larger states, kind of aligning with the goals of the Virginia Plan. The Senate, on the other hand, would give the states equal representation. So 2 senators per state, no matter how big or small the population. And that preserved the equality of the states, which, the smaller states, which is at the heart of the New Jersey Plan. The compromise also included a provision that all bills that involved taxation and revenue had to originate in the House of Representatives, which that's where the representation was based on population. So that acknowledged that since taxation kind of directly affected citizens, it should be initiated by the legislative body that was closely reflected, the people. And that structure created this deliberate tension between the two houses. So you have the House that would represent the people proportionately, and then you have the Senate that would represent the states equally. And for any bill to become a law, it would have to pass both chambers, ensuring that both the populous and the less populous states had a meaningful voice. And so this structure, you have two houses, and they have distinct roles and they have distinct methods of representation. And it wasn't just like a political compromise. It's a philosophical one. It blends like this democratic principle of rule by people with a federal principle where you have, the sovereign states and a union. And so the Great Compromise, it kind of saves the convention, but it does more than that. It does set the foundation for the American system of governance. So you have this balanced power in a way that allowed the Constitution to be ratified by large and small states. It created a check within the legislature itself, slowing the passage of laws and requiring consensus between the different constituencies. And it also reflected the idea that national governance must be both representative and respectful of state sovereignty. So the effects of this compromise, they're still felt today. Like every time a law is passed, proposed, debated, whatever, it goes through the House and the Senate. It traces back to the structure at this particular moment in 1787. So while the Great Compromise was hailed as a victory for unity, it did pave the way for other difficult compromises, most notably the Three-Fifths Compromise, which reflected very painful tensions that would continue to shape the young nation. I just realized I might be talking a little fast. I don't mean to. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning. And to say that I'm tired is an understatement. So hopefully you can get through it. If not, just let me know and I'll re record. But let's talk about the issue of slavery and how the Constitution protected slavery without ever even saying the word. Because the word slavery, it doesn't ever appear in the original U.S. Constitution, but that document is chock full of coded language, and it's nonetheless it's entrenched in it, and it's protecting the institution of slavery. You have the framers who were deeply divided on this issue. Many of them were morally conflicted. Others were very unapologetically committed to preserving slavery for economic gain. But at this time, you do have one thing that unites them, and that is the desire to form a union. And to hold that very fragile coalition together, the convention made several concessions to slavery. And each one of them came with, I don't even have an adjective. They came with consequences that would shape the nation's laws, politics, and identity for nearly a century to come. So let's talk about the Three-Fifths Clause. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. It states that representatives could and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the states based on, quote, the whole number of free persons and, quote, 3/5 of all other persons. Okay. So unpack that. You have all other persons. Who are they? I mean, clearly it's a euphemism for enslaved people, right? So for every 5 enslaved people, only 3 would be counted toward the state's total population for the purposes of representation in Congress and direct taxation. So the clause doesn't grant enslaved people any rights. It merely allows the states to use their bodies while denying them a voice or freedom to increase their political power. Okay. And the more people a state had, the more representatives it gained in the House and the more electoral college votes it received. So that meant that the slaveholding states gained additional political clout, basically, without extending any kind of democratic participation to the people being counted. Okay. So, for example, in 1790, Virginia had the largest enslaved population in the U.S. And because of the Three-Fifths Clause, they were awarded more seats in Congress and more influence over national policy, despite the fact that nearly half of their population had no rights at all. Okay. So in essence, this Three-Fifths Clause, it gave the Southern states basically a bonus for owning people. All right. It allowed them to block anti-slavery legislation, to dominate the presidency, to shape the Supreme Court decisions for decades. So this wasn't just a compromise. This was a political distortion that prioritized property over humanity. And this helped to lay the groundwork for the Civil War. Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3. It states, quote, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up. That is the Fugitive Slave Clause, and its implications are disgusting. Okay. It literally meant that even if an enslaved person escaped to a free state, they are still considered property under federal law. And the free states were required to cooperate when it came to returning individuals to their enslavers. That clause essentially nationalized slavery. It made it extend its grip into states that had outlawed it. It essentially told the northern states, hey, you may not practice slavery, but you still have to help enforce it. And that provision led to widespread abuse. Okay. You had bounty hunters that roamed free states, not only capturing escaped slaves, but also free Black Americans, some of whom were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Okay. It fueled increasing sectional tension between the North and South, and it became one of the catalysts for the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which intensified enforcement and punishment for those who assisted fugitives. Then we have Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, which states the migration or importation of such persons as of any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. Like, what? Translation? Congress couldn't ban the importation of enslaved people, and we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, until 20 years after the ratification, or 1808? Seriously? Like, why 1808? This was yet another concession to the southern states, particularly South Carolina and Georgia, which heavily relied on the international slave trade. So while you have some delegates, like particularly from the North, that had hoped to eventually like phase out slavery, this clause gave the South 2 more decades to legally traffic in human beings. Okay. And by the time the clause expired in 1808, the U.S. had imported over 200,000 enslaved Africans. Okay. So Congress did eventually outlaw the transatlantic slave trade, but domestic slavery expanded rapidly, particularly in the Deep South because of the booming cotton economy. But that clause also contained a tax loophole. So while Congress couldn't ban the trade, it could impose a tax of up to $10 per person imported. And that was a compromise that allowed the government to profit from slavery while delaying its regulation. Take that in. Like, these clauses show that slavery was not simply tolerated, like it was structurally embedded into the nation's founding legal document. So the Constitution, it created a political system that gave more power to those who enslaved others. Okay? Nationalized the enforcement of slavery, even in the states that opposed it, and allowed the international trafficking of people to continue unabated for 20 more years. And those decisions were not temporary footnotes. Like, they shaped the nation's trajectory and allowed slavery to become more deeply entrenched, more profitable, and more fiercely defended. Okay. And the cost of those compromises, nearly a century of sanctioned oppression, a civil war that claimed over 600,000 lives, and a legacy of racial injustice that still reverberates today. I mean, it's disgusting. So I ended up sleeping on it. I realized that I probably got a little spicy before. So we're going to wrap this up and we're going to talk about the Constitution. So we're going to start with Article 1, which we've already talked a little bit about. But I do want to say that it is absolutely no coincidence that Article 1 comes first. And that's because the framers of the Constitution believed that the power to make laws, not to enforce them, not to interpret them, but to actually create them, was the most central, basically the foundational function of the government, right? So they put it right up front. And we've talked about how it has 2 chambers because it created the legislative branch. I should add that in. But let's talk about what can Congress actually do, okay? So Article 1, Section 8 lays out what we call the enumerated powers of Congress, meaning that it's the specific things that Congress is allowed to do. That is like levying and collecting taxes, regulating the commerce between states and with foreign nations, establishing post offices and roads, coining money, declaring war, creating the courts that are below the Supreme Court, of course, raising and supporting, armies, navies. They can make the rules for immigration and naturalization. And the list goes on, right? But it tells us something important. And that is that the federal government is not all powerful, right? But when Congress acts within its areas of authority, it is speaking for the entire country. But I guess what happens when Congress needs to do something that's not explicitly written in the Constitution, and that's where one of the most important and most controversial phrases in the entire Constitution comes in, and that is the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause. So at the end of Section 8, you'll find this particular clause, and it says that Congress has the power to make laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Okay? So this clause, it gives Congress this implied powers. You know, the ability to pass laws that aren't specifically listed, but they're needed because they're needed to carry out, some sort of listed responsibility. For example, the Constitution doesn't say that Congress can create a bank, but it's collecting taxes, it's borrowing money, it's regulating currency, and all of that requires a financial system. So Congress can create a national bank as a means to fulfill those ends. And this clause is what gives the Constitution its flexibility. But it also raises an important question, and that is how far can Congress stretch its power before it overreaches? And this is where we have McCulloch v. Maryland. And this case is from 1819, and it sort of defines necessary and proper. And this exact question came before the Supreme Court in this case, okay? So Congress had created the second bank of the United States, which was a national bank. And the state of Maryland, they didn't like it. And they tried to tax the bank in order, we'll say, to weaken it, okay? So James McCulloch, he was the bank's cashier, and he refused to pay the tax. So the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and there were two big questions that were kind of at stake. And that was, did Congress even have the power to create a national bank? And could a state tax a federal institution? And so the Supreme Court, which was led by Chief Justice John Marshall at the time, he said, Congress does have the power to create this bank thanks to this necessary and proper clause. And no, Maryland, you cannot tax this bank because the power to tax involves the power to destroy. That's a quote. And the states can't undermine federal authority. So the decision established two critical principles here. And that is that implied powers are real and valid, and that federal law is supreme over state law. Okay? Now, Article 1 doesn't just grant powers, it also sets limits in order to protect individual rights and to prevent, abuse. For example, Congress cannot pass bills of attainder. Those are laws that declare someone guilty without a trial. It cannot pass ex post facto laws. Those are laws that punish someone for something that wasn't illegal when they did it. It can't suspend habeas corpus except in cases of, like rebellion or invasion. So that means that you can't be detained without being brought before a judge, right? And those limitations serve as important constitutional kind of guardrails, ensuring that Congress doesn't become too powerful. Now, today, Article 1 is still at the heart of really like every major policy debate. You got taxes, it's Congress. Immigration, it's Congress. Healthcare, it's Congress. War and peace, it's Congress. It is the most public-facing, should be the most directly accountable, and the most representative branch of our federal government. And yet, its power is still, we'll say it's balanced by the courts, by the president, and the people who elect its members, it's every 2 years because there's always somebody's seats who's up, but the Congress people serve for 6 years. So, again, Article 1, it tells us who makes the rules. It gives Congress the power to act, and it also has the responsibility to do so within these deliberate limitations, right? So it's essentially the blueprint for lawmaking. It's our starting point for basically everything else because it is the starting point. It tells how everything else is made. And if we don't understand how laws are made, it's going to be harder to understand how to challenge them, how to change them, how to defend them. So whether you're watching the news or you're voting in an election or taking part in a protest, again, it all starts with Article 1. Now, Article 2 of the Constitution establishes the executive branch, which is home of the presidency. And it tells us, who can be president, what they can do, and just as importantly, how to remove them if they violate the public trust. Okay. Now, we have to talk about how the founders and how they kind of imagined this role and how it evolved. The framers had a very serious dilemma on their hands because they had just fought, this very bloody war against a king, this absolute monarch who had unchecked power. And the last thing they wanted to do was to create another tyrant. Now, at the same time, they had seen a very weak, executive under the Articles of Confederation and how that had led to disorganization and indecision and really a near collapse of the government itself. So they knew that they needed a strong leader. It had to be someone who had the authority to make decisions, enforce the law, and command the nation in a time of crisis. And so the solution was to create a president who had significant powers, but you still had to tie those powers down with, the checks and balances. So Article 2 begins with, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. That's it. It is vested in one person, a single office. And that's a big deal because up until this point in history, power was typically shared, whether it was through councils or monarchs who had to act with parliaments or other advisors. But in this case, the framers opted for unity and decisiveness. And so our version of the presidency was born. Now, let's talk about what the president can actually do. So the president serves as the commander in chief of the armed forces. And that means that they lead the military. But while that's important, they cannot declare war. That is the role that Congress plays. Now, the president has the ability to act quickly in case of an emergency, but only Congress can officially take the country into war. The president also has the power to grant pardons and reprieves when it comes to federal crimes. And I see this all the time on social media. It'll be somebody who's in a state prison and they'll be like, oh, maybe Trump or whoever can, give them a pardon. No, that doesn't happen. And even in places like Georgia, the governor here doesn't have those, that doesn't have clemency powers. But anyhow, a president cannot grant a pardon or reprieve in a case of impeachment. They can make treaties, but those treaties still have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. They can appoint, ambassadors and judges and cabinet members. But again, those appointments still have to be confirmed by the Senate. They also have the duty to, take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So, in other words, they don't make the laws and they don't interpret them. They carry them out, and that's the primary function. Now, in practice, this makes the president the public face of the federal government. It's the one who shows up at press conferences, the one who, speaks after a disaster to the nation. It's one who meets with world leaders, who signs bills into law, and who gets blamed or credited when things go right or wrong, though that seems to still kind of last no matter what, how long somebody's been out of office. But Article 2 does make one thing clear, and that is the president is not above the law. And that's where impeachment comes in. So the Constitution's built-in kind of mechanism, for holding the presidents accountable is done through impeachment. And Article 2 says that, that the president, the vice president, and all civil officers of the United States can be removed if they are convicted of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And what that process looks like, which we've actually seen that, and I'm older though, so I've seen it a lot more, but it does start in the House of Representatives. And it starts where a simple majority vote is needed to impeach. So that's where they bring those formal charges. And impeachment is like an indictment in criminal law. It doesn't mean removal. It just means that the House believes that there is enough evidence to put the president on trial. And then that trial takes place in the Senate. And then you have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who is presiding over it. So, in order to remove the president from office, you then have to have 2/3 of the Senate vote to convict. And so far in history, we have had 3 presidents who have been impeached. We have had Andrew Johnson, we've had Bill Clinton, and then we have Donald Trump. And he was impeached once in 2019 and once again in 2021. But none of these guys were convicted. They all remained in office. But the fact that the process exists and it has been used does kind of remind us that the president is not supposed to be untouchable, right? And impeachment is rare, but it is real. And it's probably the most powerful, like, checks and balance in the entire Constitution. Let me think about what else. I had something else I wanted to tell you. I know what it was. So we live in an age where the executive branch has grown like massively. And presidents now do things like sign executive orders and they manage these like vast federal agencies. They control military operations and they help shape public policy, right? So in this particular case, you have to ask how much power is too much? Can a president do whatever they want as long as they say it's in the name of national security or public interest? This brings us to 2 recent court cases to kind of give us some clarity. Now, I need to pause here because I do not care what anybody's, political affiliation is. I will tell you straight out of the gate, you will learn that I am a 2-party system hater. I cannot stand it. So you'll hear me be an equal opportunity hater for pretty much everybody. So don't think that I'm like picking on anybody or anything. But the first one is the Trump v. Vance case. And this case was in the Manhattan court. It was up in Manhattan. And the DA there issued a subpoena for Trump's tax records as part of a criminal investigation. And Trump argued that a sitting president has absolute immunity from criminal investigations while in office. And the Supreme Court disagreed. It was a 7-2 decision, and the court ruled that no one, not even the president, is above the law. Okay? So the court held that the president could be subject to criminal subpoenas, investigations, whatever, just like anybody else. And that was a major kind of reaffirmation of the idea that the Constitution applies to everyone, including the person who's holding, the highest office in the land. The second case was Carroll v. Trump, and that one came a few years later. And this one involved, she was journalist, E. Jean Carroll, and she accused Donald Trump of sexual assault and then sued him for defamation after he publicly denied her claims. And Trump argued that his statements were made in his official capacity as president, so he can't be held liable for that. And the court in that case also disagreed because the ruling was that his comments were personal. They weren't presidential, and that he could be sued in civil court just like anybody else. Okay. So those cases both, kind of underscore a crucial point that the president has great power, but again, it's not unchecked. The law does still apply. So the office of the presidency is powerful, but the person holding it is never beyond accountability, even though I swear to you, sometimes it feels that way. But nonetheless, Article 2 gives us this powerful executive, the leader who can act swiftly, who can represent the nation, who can, manage a crisis, enforce laws, all of those things. But it also gives us that system to limit that power or to restrain that power, to challenge it when it's necessary, to remove it when abused. Okay. The last thing that I wanted to say is that, I know that when we think about the president, it is it it's kind of a cult of personality these days, but it's not. It is a constitutional role, and that's kind of where I want us to be looking. I don't want us to be looking at that other part of it. Um, and this constitutional role is shaped by law. It is limited by structure. It's designed to serve and not rule. Okay. Again, Article 2, one office, one person. Now let's talk about Article 3, and that's the judicial branch. So again, Article 1, it's about who makes the laws. Article 2, about who enforces the laws. And so Article 3 answers the next logical question of, well, who interprets those laws? Who decides what they mean when there is a dispute? Who settles the questions about whether a law is constitutional or not? And this job goes to the judiciary. And Article 3 lays the foundation for what this branch looks like and how it works. Okay. Now, interestingly, or maybe not to you, but Article 3 is the shortest of the 3 articles when creating the 3 branches of government. It's only a few paragraphs long, but even though it is brief, I would say power is still massive. And that's because that article gives us something that no other branch can, and that is a final answer. Okay. It begins by establishing a single court. That's it. Okay. It simply states that the judicial power of the United States can be vested in one Supreme Court. And then it leaves it up to Congress to create any of the inferior courts or the lower federal courts if they are needed. Okay. Now, in practice, we have a 3-tiered system. We have the Supreme Court at the top, we have the Court of Appeals in the middle, and we have the district courts at the bottom. And Congress created those lower courts over time. But again, it all starts with that one sentence in Article 3 that says, there shall be one Supreme Court. All right. Now, Article 3 gives federal courts the power to hear cases involving the Constitution, federal laws, treaties, disputes between states, and disputes between citizens of different states. It also gives cases involving like ambassadors or foreign governments, and you even have the maritime or admiralty issues like shipping or events that happen in the seas, right? And that is known as federal jurisdiction. So in plain terms, it defines what kinds of cases the federal courts are allowed to hear. And everything else that's not on that list is going to be left to the state courts and lower, right? Now, in our system, we have dual sovereignty, meaning we have the state and federal governments. They have power and courts, right? So your state might have its own constitution, which I'm pretty sure they all do, but it'll have its own laws and it'll have its own court system. But when the issue involves the U.S. Constitution or a federal law, it can be moved into federal court. Now, let's talk about the independence of the judicial branch. And this is something that the framers cared kind of deeply about, right? Federal judges are appointed for life. We can argue about this all day long, even with term limits or age limits on the Congress people too, and term limits, but I digress. So more precisely, they're serving during what would be considered good behavior. They don't have term limits. They don't have to run for election. They can't be fired for making unpopular decisions, and their salaries cannot be reduced while they're in office. And why is that? Because the framers said so. They wanted judges who could make decisions based on the law and not on politics. They didn't want judges looking over their shoulders, like wondering if Congress or the president or the public might punish them for doing the right thing. So that independence is kind of one of the hallmarks of our system. Now, there's something that's not in Article 3 that we now consider kind of a defining feature of the courts, and that's the power of judicial review. And judicial review is the power of the courts to strike down laws or executive actions, even that violate the Constitution. So, in other words, if Congress passes a law that's unconstitutional, the courts can say, no, that law is invalid, right? If the president issues an executive order that goes too far, courts can block it. And that's an enormous power, okay? But the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that the courts have it. So where does this come from? It comes from a case called Marbury versus Madison. And this was the very first time that the Supreme Court declared a law passed by Congress to be unconstitutional. And in that decision, Chief Justice John Marshall, he wrote that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. And that single sentence sort of cemented the idea of judicial review. And ever since, it's been one of the most important functions of the judiciary. I would say without it, there would be like no final referee in our system, like no one to call balls and strikes when Congress or the president oversteps. And Lord knows we need that. Now, let's also talk about the balance between federal and state power, because Article 3 plays a big role here. In the earlier days, one of the biggest tensions was how much power should the national government have and how much should be left to the states, right? And we've already seen that federal courts can hear cases that involve multiple states or citizens from different states. But the Constitution also says that federal law is supreme, and that's reinforced in Article 6 of the Supremacy Clause. So what happens when state law conflicts with federal law? In the federal courts, they step in. They interpret the Constitution, they resolve the disputes, and they often have the final word. So, for example, when Southern states passed laws to maintain segregation, federal courts struck them down. When the states tried to restrict, voting rights in ways that violated federal law, federal courts intervened. So this is Article 3 in action, where it's balancing the power between the state and the federal governments. Let's also talk about the idea of the checks and balances, though. The judiciary checks the legislative and executive branches, right? And they get to do that by ruling on whether their actions are constitutional. And that's the judicial review. But it's also checked by the other branches. So the president gets to nominate the federal judges. The Senate gets to confirm or reject those nominations. And Congress can change the structure of the lower courts, even like passing constitutional amendments, to override certain court decisions. So even though federal judges do serve for a life, they are still part of a more broad system of kind of mutual oversight. And they're not just kind of operating in a vacuum, so to speak. So now we have Article 4, which is, the other provisions of federalism. And it deals with how the states relate to each other and to the federal government. And it's essentially a set of kind of operational rules for managing the nation that's made up of independent but united states. So we have Section 2 of Article 4 requires that if a person commits a crime in one state and then goes to the other, the governor of that state where the person is found has to return them to the state where the crime occurred. So this particular clause is going to prevent people from evading justice just simply by crossing a state line, okay? You have Section 3, which gives Congress the power to admit new states into the Union. But it does come with a rule. New states cannot be formed from the territory of existing states without the consent of those states involved and with Congress. So this clause helped to kind of guide the country's westward expansion, and it in kind of a orderly and legal manner, right? And it also preserved the autonomy of the existing states while allowing for that national growth. Okay. So, like when West Virginia separated from Virginia during the Civil War, that had to be approved by both the reorganized Virginia government and Congress. Also, in Section 3, the Constitution grants Congress the authority to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations for the U.S. territories and other federal lands. So that would include how territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, how are those territories managed? How the U.S. land is, used for military bases, national parks, even Native American reservations. And it's a reminder that not all parts of the U.S. have statehood status. And Congress holds authority, governing authority over those. You also have the full faith and credit clause and the privileges and immunities clause. And so while this is, these are important, okay? So the full faith and credit clause will actually come up in multiple classes, but this requires states to honor the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. So like your marriage license, your driver's license, any kind of court judgments like child support, things like that, they have to be enforced, okay? And they have to be recognized. The privileges and immunities is to ensure that the citizens of each state are entitled to the same legal protections when visiting or living in another state. So like a New Yorker who might be traveling to, say, Texas, they have the same access to the courts as somebody who is living in Texas, okay? So Article 3, kind of creates our guardian of the Constitution because the judiciary is intended to protect those individual rights and kind of it limits the governmental overreach. But Article 4 is kind of ensuring that the U.S. is more than just this kind of loose alliance, right? It's a functional union of cooperating states, all right? And again, together, these articles are supposed to help make sure that we have like this national cohesion and this balance of power that's, intended to keep the government both accountable and adaptable. Now, Article 5 answers a very simple but essential question, and that is, how do we change the Constitution? So when the framers wrote this document, they knew it wasn't perfect, right? They didn't pretend to have all the answers for all time, all right? They built a process to amend it. And that was for, future generations to be able to add or fix or adapt the highest law of the land, okay? But they also knew that making changes to the Constitution should never be easy. It should be possible, but only when there's a really strong agreement from, across the board. So there's two ways to propose an amendment. First is that Congress can propose the amendment when they have 2/3 of both the House and the Senate agree. And we know that that's so hard because we can't get them to agree on anything. But that is a method that has been used for all 27 amendments that we have thus far, and even including the Bill of Rights. The second way is it can propose if there's 2/3 of the state legislatures. So that's 34 out of 50. Okay. And they agree that they can call, they agree and they call a constitutional convention. Now, that has never actually happened. Okay. And actually, a lot of scholars kind of worry that if a convention was called today, it would be ugly. It could spiral out of control. It could end up rewriting more than just, one amendment, right? But it is still technically possible. But once an amendment has been proposed, it still has to be ratified. And again, there's two ways to do that. You either have 3/4 of the state legislatures approve it, which is 38 states, or you have 3/4 of special ratifying conventions in the states approve it. And that method has only been used once. And that was for the 21st Amendment that repealed prohibition. So think about this. You've had over 11,000 amendments that have been proposed since 1789. but only 27 have made it all the way through. Okay. So that tells you how hard it is to change the Constitution. And that is absolutely by design. Okay. For example, the Bill of Rights was added using this process. So were major landmark amendments like the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. You also have the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection. You have the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. You have the 26th, that lowered the voting age to 18. And those amendments weren't just like legal changes, they were like moments of national growth. Okay. And Article 5 is what made it happen. So you have a debate about whether or not the Constitution is a living document. Okay. I will stand firm and say that it is. I'll die on that hill, as the kids say these days. And that what they mean is this. It's not meaning that it's going to shift with the wind, you know, it's not going to just be for every little thing, but it means that the people through this like rigorous process came together and said, we need to update these rules. And so it's able to change. So therefore it's living. We can debate that later. Okay, so Article 6 contains the Supremacy Clause and the national authority. So this one is about power and unity. And again, it says that the Constitution is the highest law of the land. Highest, like higher than any state law, any local ordinance, any acts of Congress. And if those are in conflict with the Constitution, they're invalid. This is the Supremacy Clause. And it says in Article 6, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. So it means that if a state passes a law that contradicts the Constitution, that state law is automatically invalid. If a state court, disagrees with a federal law that's constitutional, federal law wins. If a state constitution tries to grant or take away a right that conflicts with the U.S. Constitution, not happening, okay? But what's interesting here is that Article 6 applies not just to laws, but to people, and specifically public officials. It requires that all judges, legislators, and executive officers, federal and state alike, take an oath to uphold the Constitution. Technically, I work for the state. I had to do an oath to uphold the Constitution. Governors, state judges, everything, they're bound by the U.S. Constitution and not just their state constitutions. Now, we do have to talk about something important, which is the U.S. is a federal system, right? And that means we have two layers of government. We have the federal government and we have the state government. And each one of them has their own powers. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, and that's the dual sovereignty. Okay. So states can make laws on things like education, marriage, traffic, criminal, whatever, right? The federal government makes laws about immigration and commerce between states and national defense. But when those two systems end up colliding, okay, like when a state law and a federal law are opposite of one another, the federal law is going to win. And that goes back to that Supremacy Clause, okay? So like if you have a state that passes a law that, say, bans, federal agents from enforcing a federal environmental protection law, right? The courts would strike the state law down because that federal law is absolutely supreme. Now, because of the Supremacy Clause, the Supreme Court gets to be the referee. So if a law passed by Congress or like an action by the president or a law passed by the state legislature, it violates, the Constitution, then the courts and ultimately the Supreme Court is the one that gets to decide. And again, that goes back to that judicial review, which again isn't explicitly stated in Article 3, but Article 6 does make it enforceable. And it's the foundation of some of the most important cases in U.S. history. We're talking cases that have, defined civil rights, protected freedoms, even checked abuses of power, right? And it's Article 6 is giving us this, constitutional legal supremacy. And again, it's to ensure that, all government, it doesn't matter if it's city hall or Congress, like we're all operating under this rule book, right? That the Constitution is supreme over everything else. And again, like I said, I'll die on this hill. The Constitution to me is not just like a historic document. It is a living, breathing contract between the government and the people that it governs. And I think that it is built to last, but I think it's also built to listen. But it is designed, it's designed to stand firm. And it's built on a foundation that nothing, not even the government itself, can rise above. Now we're almost finished, but let's talk about the signing of the Constitution, because again, this was one of those really dramatic and like symbolic moments in American history. And it happened in the assembly room of the Pennsylvania State House, which is now called Independence Hall. And you had months of argument and tension and compromise and exhaustion, like a near like collapse. Okay. These delegates, at the Constitutional Convention, they finally finished their work. And what began as a mission to just revise the Articles of Confederation had transformed into something far more radical. And that was an entirely new framework for the government. And this wasn't just, ink on parchment. This was a document that would define how powers are going to be distributed, how rights are going to be protected, and how a diverse group of states, again, each with their own identity and interest, could work together as a single nation. Okay. But here's the thing. Not everybody agreed. So out of the 55 delegates who participated in the convention over the course of this very long summer, only 42 of them were present on that final day. And of the 42, only 39 signed the document. That means that there were 3 men that were in the room that refused to sign. And one of them was George Mason of Virginia. And he had been one of the most active and vocal delegates during the convention, but he refused to add his name to the final draft. And his reason was because it lacked a Bill of Rights. And Mason believed very passionately that a government that powerful needed very explicit protections for individual liberties. And it needed to be written into the document itself. And without them, he feared that this new federal government could become just as tyrannical as the monarchy that they had just escaped. And he wasn't alone in that concern, right? And it eventually led to the creation of and adoption of the Bill of Rights just a few years later. But despite those concerns, there was a strong push to still unify. And that's where Benjamin Franklin stepped in. And he was the elder of the statesmen. And he was too frail to stand, too frail to speak for long periods. And on that final day, someone else read a short speech that he had written. And in it, Franklin urged the delegates to rise above their personal objections and support the document, not because it was perfect, but because it was necessary. And he acknowledged that there were parts of the Constitution he didn't like, but he also recognized that no group of men, no matter how wise or how well-intentioned, could create a perfect plan. And he said, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults because I think a general government necessary for us. I doubt, too, whether any convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution. And he then moved that the Constitution be approved unanimously and signed by all states present. But again, it wasn't, literally unanimous because you still had 3 that said no. But his call for unity did work because those remaining delegates, even those with serious concerns, stepped forward one by one to sign the document. And that moment, like those signatures, they didn't mean the job was done because this was really just a beginning. The Constitution still had to be ratified by the states, and that would be like a whole other like long and contentious battle. But on that day, in that room, you still have something powerful that was kind of set in motion. And the Constitution of the United States was born not into perfection, but, pragmatism, or not in agreement, but in compromise. And I think that's a little bit about what makes it remarkable. Because while you had these, 39 men that signed on that day, the future would depend on millions more, generations of Americans who are going to argue over it, amend it, fight to defend it, even struggle to like live up to it. But the legacy of the signing of the Constitution, it wasn't just like this victory lap. It was a starting line. And from that starting line, this whole like American experiment kind of took off. Now, once the Constitution was signed, again, work wasn't finished because this is where a lot would say this real battle began. Because again, it does have to go and be ratified, which is formally approved by 9 of the 13 states. Okay. And that would prove to be no small task. Across the country, you had these fierce debates that were erupting. Debates not just about the text of the Constitution, but the nature of power, the nature of liberty. What kind of country would the United States become? And on one side of the debate, you have the Federalists. And the Federalists were the ones who believed in a strong central government, a government that could raise taxes and maintain a national military, regulate commerce, unify the states under one effective system. And they argued that the Articles of Confederation had been way too weak. So under that system, the federal government, again, they couldn't collect taxes and it couldn't even enforce its own laws. So states were behaving like they were separate countries, printing their own money, ignoring these national decisions. And to the Federalists, that chaos proved one thing, and that was that the country needed a stronger foundation. So the Federalists supported the new Constitution because it created a federal government with real authority. But it still had, authority that was, bound by checks and balances and the separation of powers. And some of the most famous Federalists include Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And those 3 men wrote a series of essays that would become to known as the Federalist Papers. And they were designed to persuade the public and the state legislatures to support the new Constitution. But not everybody was convinced because on the other side, you have the anti-Federalists, okay? But I should say, don't let this name fool you because they weren't anti-government or anything. They were just people who were kind of deeply skeptical of centralized power, kind of like a lot of us are today. Again, many of them had just fought in this war against tyranny, and they weren't about to hand over like too much authority to this new national government. And the anti-Federalists believed that the Constitution gave the federal government too much control, especially when it came to the states. And they worried that the president could become too powerful like a king, that Congress might pass laws that basically crush like the state sovereignty, and even worse, that the individual liberties, like they're not protected. So, again, this is because the original Constitution didn't include the Bill of Rights. So there was no clear protection of freedom of speech, no guarantee to, a right to a fair trial or the right to bear arms or, the promise of religious freedom. Okay. And to the anti-Federalists, this was a deal breaker. Okay. They feared without a Bill of Rights that the government would be able to infringe on personal freedoms and people would have no constitutional protection. Okay. And some of the most famous anti-Federalists were Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Thomas Jefferson. Although Jefferson was in France during the debate, But his writings and his correspondence still show that he had a deep concern about the lack of rights, protections, all of those things in the original document. Which, by the way, that goes back to have you seen Hamilton? Because that's portrayed in there too. But anyhow, country, it's at a crossroads at this point. And on one hand, you have the Federalists who are pushing hard for unity and this national strength. And on the other hand, you had the Anti-Federalists who were warning against unchecked power and demanding protection of individual rights. And for months, the states debated. Newspapers were filled with editorials. You had town halls that were echoing with, arguments. You have states that were ratifying conventions, or the states ratifying conventions. These became battlegrounds of ideas. And some states, they ratified very quickly, but others, they wouldn't budge. Okay. And the tipping point came with a compromise. The Federalists promised that if the Constitution was ratified, then the very first act of the new Congress would be to add a Bill of Rights. And that promise was enough to sway many of the hesitant states. So one by one, states started coming on board, and on I think it was 1788 was when New Hampshire was the ninth state to ratify the Constitution. And now it was law of the land. Okay. And after this, again, you have the protections that are still needed. Pressures, continuing to build, make them stronger. And so 4 years later, the 10 amendments that we now call the Bill of Rights were actually adopted. So in the end, the ratification debate wasn't like a failure of unity. This was more of an example of democracy at work. It forced the framers to listen, it demanded compromise, and it reminded everyone that power, no matter how well intentioned, it still had to be balanced by liberty. And that's what the Anti-Federalists fought for. That's what the Federalists eventually agreed to. And that's how we ended up with a Constitution that is both powerful and we'll call it protective for now. We'll break it down into the cases and how it didn't necessarily protect as we go through the individual amendments. But it was intended to be protective. But a government that governs, again, never forgets its limits. We have this union that's holding together, not because, not because it wants to, but because we, the people, agreed to be held by it. Now, we're going to very briefly talk about the Bill of Rights, again, because we're going to break down the individual amendments into other lectures. So, but the Bill of Rights, they are, some of the most recognizable and fiercely defended rights in our history. So the Bill of Rights is essentially, the rule book for protecting people from the government. It tells us what the government can't do. It limits power not just from kings or tyrants, but from our own elected officials. And the original Constitution didn't actually include any of this. Okay. So when the Constitution was signed, it contained no explicit protections for freedom of speech or freedom of religion or due process, no, guarantee to a jury trial, no promise of privacy, no mention of the right to bear arms. And that omission is what nearly sank the whole entire thing. All right. So, as we go through and, we talked about already like the ratification debates. Again, you have the Anti-Federalists who were deeply uncomfortable with this idea of a powerful federal government that had no specific limits. And they just wanted a clear set of protections so that this new national government wouldn't become just as abusive as the monarchy they had fought to escape. And this is where the compromise again was struck. So we have the 10 amendments. And the goal was simple. We needed to balance the powers of the new federal government with the rights of the states and the rights of the individual citizens. Okay? So The amendments, they were specific, they were concrete, they were personal, they were real, and they were very necessary. And again, we'll talk about them one by one. I'm just going to go over them very quickly now. But the First Amendment, probably the most famous, especially used wrong because people will say, I just got out of Facebook jail. My, right to free speech was violated. It's not correct, people. But it is for many people the most important. So the First Amendment protects 5 freedoms. That's the freedom of speech, religion, press, the right to peacefully assemble, and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. So this guarantees you that you can speak your mind, you can practice or not practice any religion, you can publish your ideas, you can get together and protest, and you can demand change without fear of government punishment. All right? Second Amendment, it's highly debated, and that's the right to keep and bear arms. So originally tied to the idea of this well-regulated militia, today it's commonly cited in discussions about individual gun ownership and gun control laws. And it doesn't matter what your view on the application itself is. The Second Amendment is fundamentally about protecting the individual's right to security and self-defense. The Third Amendment is probably a little more obscure today, but at the time that it was written, it was very deeply meaningful. And it says that the government cannot force you to house soldiers in your home during peacetime, only in wartime if the law permits it. And that came from that colonial experience under the British rule, where the citizens were often required to, take in the troops against their will. And it's about privacy. It's about consent. It's about, drawing a firm line between this is my house and the state. The Fourth Amendment is about privacy and security. It protects the people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. So that means that no one can come into your home, search your belongings, or take your property unless they have a warrant. And that warrant has to be based on probable cause. And that's basically the foundation of your right to feel secure in your home, your car, your phone, whatever. And it has become a lot more relevant, particularly in the digital age. Then you have the Fifth Amendment. And this outlines how the government must treat you if you're accused of a crime. So you can't be forced to testify against yourself, which is like, I plead the Fifth. You can't be tried twice for the same crime, which is double jeopardy. You have to receive due process of law before you're deprived of life, liberty, or property. And if the government takes your property for public use, they have to give you fair compensation. That's your eminent domain. So the Fifth Amendment ensures that you don't lose your rights just because you've been accused of something. The Sixth Amendment is all about the right to a fair trial in criminal cases. And it's going to guarantee you that you'll be informed of what charges are against you, that you have the right to a speedy and public trial, that you can confront witnesses who testify against you, and that you can bring your own witnesses. But even more importantly, is that you have the right to a lawyer to defend you, even if you can't afford one. And the Sixth Amendment isn't just about trials. It's about ensuring justice, through transparency and speed and fairness. The Seventh Amendment deals with civil cases or disputes between people or people and businesses or businesses and businesses rather than crimes. And it guarantees the right to a jury trial in federal cases where the amount is exceeding $20. And in today's terms, that amount is symbolic. But the principle of that still stands, that juries decide facts, not judges alone, okay? And that's another safeguard against government overreach or any kind of elite influence in legal matters. Then you have the Eighth Amendment, which protects against excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. And this is the constitutional backbone for debates around things like prison conditions or solitary confinement, or most frequently known and probably debated by many of us is the death penalty. But it basically says that the government has the right to punish, but not torture. Justice can be firm, but it can't be inhumane. The Ninth Amendment, a little more abstract, but I would still say incredibly important. And it says that just because a right isn't listed in the Constitution doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So, in other words, the people retain other rights too, rights that might not be written down, but rights that are still real and protected. And that's going to prevent the government from arguing, well, it's not in the Constitution, so it doesn't count. Ninth Amendment's like, not so fast. It does count. Then you have the 10th Amendment, and that is all about federalism. It says that any powers not specifically given to the federal government and not prohibited by the states belong to the states or to the people. And this was meant to kind of calm the fears that the federal government would become too powerful by reserving some authority for local governments in the communities. And it's the constitutional basis for state level control over things like policing or, education and zoning laws. So in short, I know it's not in short now, but the Bill of Rights, it wasn't just added as like this afterthought. It was added because the people demanded it. And the people knew that a constitution, again, that was giving, out government powers without also like adding more limitations was incomplete. So we have, we need those guarantees, the right to remain silent, presumption of innocence, all of those things. And all of it started with the Bill of Rights. As I said before, I stand on the grounds that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that is intended to change, which I think makes it become a timeless document. And again, your opinion may differ, and that's okay. But we'll actually dig in and kind of talk about it a little bit more. But I just wanted to kind of end with that thought because your assignment for this week is going to be about debating that very thing. So anyhow, again, you've done the hard part here, which was listening to me babble all this time. So now you have to go make some sense of it. Until next time.